There is a submarine sitting on the floor of the North Sea right now. It has been there for over 80 years. It is intact. It is identifiable. It is real. And not a single nation on Earth will admit it belongs to them. Think about what that means. Every country that fought in World War II kept records. Meticulous, obsessive, cross-referenced records. They counted every ship, every crew, every vessel lost. Naval historians have spent decades building the most exhaustive military archive in human history. And yet, this submarine, this very real, very physical, undeniable object sitting in the cold, dark water, does not appear in any of them. That is not a mystery. That is a problem. Here is something that no official press release will tell you. Something that the quiet circles of maritime historians and naval intelligence analysts have been circling around with extraordinary unease since this discovery was confirmed. When a survey team lowered their sonar equipment into the waters of the North Sea, not to search for submarines, not to investigate wartime history, but to conduct a routine seabed mapping operation, what appeared on their screens was not what any of them expected. The sonar return was clean, defined, and unmistakable. Steel hull, intact pressure casing, conning tower silhouette. What sat below them on the ocean floor was a World War II-era submarine, in a condition that defied the passage of 8 decades underwater. That alone would be remarkable. Submarines corrode. They collapse under the pressure of cold seawater. They are consumed by the biological and chemical processes of the deep. Finding one largely intact after 80 years in the North Sea is already extraordinary. But the discovery became something else entirely when the team did what any responsible maritime survey group would do next. They contacted the naval archives. They sent photographs, sonar profiles, hull measurements, structural details. They contacted the British, the Germans, the Dutch, the Norwegians, the Americans, the Poles, every navy that operated submarines in the North Sea theater during the Second World War. They sent their data, and they waited for an answer. And the answer they received from every single one of those countries was the same. We have no record of this vessel. This submarine does not belong to us. But here is where it gets worse. This was not the response of nations being careless or disorganized. This was the response of naval bureaucracies, whose entire identity is built on knowing exactly what happened to every vessel they ever commissioned. When a warship sinks, that loss is recorded with almost painful precision. The date, the coordinates, the cause, the crew manifest, the mission it was conducting. These records are not merely administrative. They are sacred obligations to the men who did not come home. The United States Navy lost 52 submarines during World War II and has documented each one of them with individual histories, crew lists, and approximate locations. Germany lost somewhere between 700 and 800 U-boats, and the German Naval Archives, the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, maintains records on virtually every single one. Britain, Norway, the Netherlands, Poland, all of them keep these ledgers with the gravity of a nation fulfilling its final duty to its dead. When every one of those nations looks at the sonar profile of this submarine and says, "Not ours," they are not saying they lost track of it. They are saying it does not match any vessel in their inventory that should be in that location, and that distinction matters enormously, because there is only a small number of possible explanations for what that means, and none of them are comfortable. Read that again. Every country that fought World War II in the North Sea has been contacted. Every archive has been consulted, and the vessel sitting on that seafloor does not appear to belong to any of them. The official position of maritime historians has, for years, been that every submarine lost in the Second World War has been accounted for. The records were too meticulous. Too many nations were involved. Too much effort was invested after the war in tracking these losses. The idea of an unknown, unclaimed submarine from that era has been categorically dismissed as impossible. Except now there is one, sitting 180 feet beneath the surface, waiting. The North Sea is one of the most heavily studied bodies of water on the planet from a historical standpoint. It was the theater of some of the most intense naval warfare in human history. British and German forces fought a brutal, grinding campaign beneath those waves for 6 years. Thousands of vessels were lost, hundreds of submarines. The seabed is, in the words of one maritime archaeologist, essentially a museum that nobody designed. Survey teams have been mapping it for decades. Energy companies have been installing pipelines and cables through it, requiring detailed geological assessments. Scientists have been cataloging its ecology. And yet, this submarine sat there, unseen, unmapped, unrecorded for 80 years. Think about what that means for a moment. This object is roughly the size of a Boeing 737 aircraft. It is a steel vessel that displaces over 1,000 tons. It has been sitting in relatively shallow water. 180 feet is well within the range of sport divers, not some abyssal trench beyond the reach of equipment. And nobody found it. Nobody looked for it. Because nobody knew it was supposed to be there. And this is where everything changes. Because the question is no longer just, whose submarine is this? The question has become something far more disturbing. How does a submarine end up on the floor of the North Sea without any nation losing one there? How does a vessel that size go down in those waters during the most heavily monitored naval conflict in history and generate no record, no report, no mention in any archive anywhere? The submariners who crewed these vessels were not ghosts. They had families, they had service numbers, they had orders that came from somewhere and were intended to go somewhere. So where did this one come from, and where was it going? To understand why naval experts are so unsettled by this, you need to understand the world of wartime submarine accounting and just how obsessive it was. During World War II, Germany commissioned and deployed what historians now estimate as somewhere between 150 and 1,200 U-boats. Of these, roughly 700 to 800 were destroyed or lost. The German Naval Command, the Kriegsmarine, tracked every single vessel through a system of operational logs, radio communication records, and command reports. When a U-boat went missing, the absence itself became a data point. They knew when a submarine stopped reporting. They knew what patrol zone it had been assigned to. They knew its last known position from its final radio transmission. The loss was recorded even if the exact circumstances were unknown. The Allies did the same. British naval intelligence was intercepting German communications through the now famous Enigma decryption operation at Bletchley Park. They were tracking U-boat movements with a level of sophistication that the Germans did not fully realize. When a U-boat went down, there was often a British record of the attack that killed it, even when the Germans had no record of what happened. Both sides, in other words, were keeping score. And between those two sets of records, the accounting was considered complete. But here's the detail that informed sources in the maritime research community are reluctant to discuss publicly. The accounting was never quite as perfect as it seemed. German naval records were deliberately destroyed toward the end of the war. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin, significant portions of the Kriegsmarine's operational archives were burned, shredded, or sunk. What survived was comprehensive but not total. The British records at Bletchley Park and the Admiralty were themselves incomplete in places where communications were disrupted, or where the nature of an engagement was ambiguous. There are, in the assessment of serious historians, small pockets of uncertainty within what appears to be a closed record. Gaps that were papered over by post-war reconciliation efforts. Cases where both sides assumed the other had the precise information and where both assumptions were slightly wrong. Most of those gaps involve vessels in distant theaters, the Pacific, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean. Not the North Sea, which was one of the most closely watched bodies of water in the conflict, which makes the presence of this submarine not just unusual but categorically strange. It should not be possible to lose track of a submarine in the North Sea during World War II. That is precisely what the experts keep saying, and yet here we are. Now, there is something else that deserves attention here, something that most people examining this story are not fully confronting. The submarine was found intact, not partially intact, not a scattered debris field, not a crushed pressure hull collapsed under the weight of water and time. Intact. The conning tower is present. The hull structure is coherent. The vessel, by the accounts of those who have reviewed the sonar imagery, appears to have settled on the seabed in a manner consistent with a controlled sinking or a sudden catastrophic loss that left the structural integrity largely undisturbed. This matters because it eliminates certain explanations. A submarine destroyed in combat by depth charges or aerial bombing typically does not land intact. The explosive energy required to breach a pressure hull and kill the crew is enough to cause serious structural damage. What the sonar is showing is not a vessel that was violently destroyed. It is a vessel that went down, and went down in a way that left its form largely preserved. And this is where it gets complicated in a way that most analysts are dancing around. One of the possible explanations, perhaps the only explanation that fully accounts for all of the known facts, is that this submarine was intentionally sunk, not in combat, but deliberately scuttled, which means someone put it down there on purpose, which means someone knew it was there and chose not to tell anyone. The practice of scuttling submarines was not unusual at the end of the war. As the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, the German Navy ordered Operation Regenbogen, Operation Rainbow, which called for the scuttling of remaining U-boats to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. Hundreds of submarines were sent to the bottom intentionally. The Allies, discovering this, halted the operation and seized what remained. In the chaos of those final weeks, with naval command structures disintegrating and communication breaking down, there were certainly vessels that were scuttled without clean records of where they went down. But those vessels were German, and they should appear in German records as assigned to the scuttling order, unless this was not a scuttling under official orders, unless this was something else entirely. Here is what informed observers in the naval history community are beginning to quietly consider. In the final months of World War II, there were submarines operating in the North Sea that were not conducting standard patrol missions. Some were used for personnel transport. Some were used to move valuable materials. Some were used for missions that had no official designation in the surviving records because those records were among the first things burned. The famous case of U-35203 illustrates this perfectly. This was one of Nazi Germany's most advanced submarines, a Type 21 Electroboot, capable of traveling from Europe to South America without surfacing, that was found buried in the seafloor off the north coast of Denmark in 2018. For 70 years, its absence had fueled speculation that it had escaped to South America carrying senior Nazi officials and looted wealth. When it was finally found, it was barely 9 miles from where British pilots had reported sinking it. But here is the critical detail. The museum that found it openly stated that nobody knows what is inside the hull. Nobody knows what it was carrying when it went down. The records of its final mission do not exist. Think about what the Type WWII could do. It had a displacement of over 1,600 tons on the surface. It was powered by 2 diesel engines and 4 electric motors, allowing it to stay submerged for days at a time, a revolutionary capability that rendered it virtually undetectable by the anti-submarine technology of the era. It had a range that, according to the Sea War Museum Jutland, would have allowed it to travel non-stop from the German coast to Argentina without coming up for air. It was the engineering triumph of the Kriegsmarine, so advanced that after the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union used its design as the basis for their own post-war submarine programs. The American Tang-class submarines and the Soviet Whiskey-class submarines, vessels that remained in active service into the 1980s, were both directly inspired by the Type WWII. The enemy's submarine was so superior to anything the victors had built that they copied it and deployed it for 4 more decades. Only a handful of Type WWIIs actually entered operational service. The program was ambitious, 118 boats ordered, but production was sabotaged, delayed, and ultimately overwhelmed by the pace of Allied bombing campaigns against German shipyards. Of those that were completed, most were scuttled under Operation Rainbow. A small number were captured. The records on the rest are, in the words of one historian, not as complete as we would like them to be. The real story, and this is the part that most coverage of this discovery is missing entirely, is that the presence of an unidentified, unclaimed submarine in the North Sea does not just raise questions about WWII record-keeping. It raises questions about what those records were designed to obscure, because every major naval power at the end of World War II had a profound strategic interest in certain things not being found. The British wanted the full scope of German technical development kept quiet so it could be absorbed and exploited rather than shared. The Americans wanted certain intelligence about Nazi escape routes and the movement of looted assets to remain classified for decades. The Soviets wanted the same. None of the victorious powers had an interest in the world knowing exactly how much of Germany's military technology and how many of Germany's senior figures slipped through the net in those final chaotic months of 1945. And so when a sonar ping comes back from 180 feet below the North Sea surface and reveals a submarine that nobody will claim, the silence of those naval archives is not simply the absence of information. It may, in some cases, be the presence of a decision. A deliberate choice made 80 years ago to let certain things disappear beneath the waves and stay there. The Dutch submarine HNLMS K. Tontuk provides an interesting parallel here. This vessel was supposedly scuttled in deep water during the Japanese advance through the Dutch East Indies in 1942. For decades, the historical record stated it had gone down in water too deep to be found. Then, in January 2025, a team of divers from Rexploration located it using magnetic survey data off the coast of Western Australia, at a depth of only 40 meters, and in a position significantly different from where the official records claimed it had been sunk. The Western Australian Museum and the Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency confirmed the identification. The submarine was not where history said it would be. The records were wrong, not by a small margin, wrong enough that the vessel was never found during 8 decades of searching, because everyone was looking in the wrong place, based on official documentation that turned out to be inaccurate. Now ask yourself what happens when you multiply that kind of documentary imprecision across hundreds of vessels, across dozens of navies, across 6 years of some of the most chaotic naval warfare in recorded history, in conditions where communications were frequently disrupted, records were deliberately destroyed, and the victors had strong incentives to control the narrative of what happened and what was lost. What you get is a North Sea floor that contains, at minimum, the real possibility of vessels that don't appear in any record. Not because they were never built, not because they never sailed, but because the paper trail that should connect them to history was severed either by accident or by design. Here is something that makes this even more significant. The North Sea seabed survey that found this submarine was not a dedicated archaeological expedition. It was a commercial survey, the kind conducted routinely by energy companies, telecommunications firms laying undersea cables, and government agencies monitoring environmental conditions. The technology being used today to map the seafloor is orders of magnitude more capable than anything available even 20 years ago, Multi-beam echo sounders and side-scan sonar systems can now produce photographic quality images of the ocean floor at depths that were previously impossible to survey with such precision. What this means is that we are, right now, in the early stages of a systematic rediscovery of what the seafloor actually contains versus what the historical record claims it contains. And those two things are beginning to diverge in ways that naval historians did not expect. The forensic methodology for finding lost submarines has evolved dramatically. Researchers now combine magnetic anomaly surveys, which detect the presence of large iron and steel objects by measuring distortions in the Earth's magnetic field, with side-scan sonar imaging, remotely operated vehicle video reconnaissance, and cross-referencing against digitized historical archives that were only made fully accessible in the last decade. The combination of these tools is revealing wreck sites that were invisible to previous generations of searchers. The HMS Trooper, a British submarine that vanished during a secret mission in the Aegean Sea in 1943 with 64 crew members aboard, sat undiscovered for 81 years. When researcher Kostas Thokterides finally located it in October 2024, using shipboard sonar and an ROV named Super Achille, it was found in a region where previous searches had never looked because the official historical narrative had everyone searching too far east. The vessel was resting at 830 feet in the notoriously treacherous Icarian Sea, broken into 3 pieces by what investigators believe was a German mine. The wreck had been there all along. The search had simply been guided by records that were wrong about where it was. These discoveries are accumulating. They are not isolated events. They represent a pattern, a gap between what the official historical record claims and what the physical evidence of the seafloor is starting to reveal. And the deeper and more comprehensively we map these waters, the larger that gap appears to be growing. Which brings us back to the submarine lying on the floor of the North Sea, the one that nobody will claim, the one that experts insist cannot exist, while simultaneously being unable to explain it away. Because the experts are not wrong about the quality of the wartime records. Those records are as complete as surviving documentation allows them to be. What they may be wrong about is the assumption that surviving documentation is the same thing as complete documentation. There is a difference between a record that says, this submarine went down here, and a record that says every submarine is accounted for. The first is a data point. The second is a conclusion. And this unclaimed vessel is a challenge to that conclusion in the most direct and physical way possible. What is it carrying? That question has barely been asked publicly, and yet it is perhaps the most consequential question attached to this entire story. Because an intact submarine is not just a hull, it is a sealed environment. It contains whatever was inside it when it went down. Weapons, navigation equipment, documents, cargo. And, in the context of a vessel operating in the North Sea in the final years of World War II, cargo is a word that opens into an abyss of historical possibility. Were there personnel? Were there materials being moved under orders that were never committed to paper? Were there assets? The kind of assets that post-war governments on all sides were eager to see vanish permanently, sealed inside that hull and committed to the deep deliberately? Nobody knows, because nobody has been inside it, because technically, legally, it doesn't belong to anyone. And in the strange and arcane world of maritime law, that ambiguity matters enormously. Unclaimed wrecks in international or disputed waters exist in a legal gray zone where responsibility for investigation, preservation, and access is unclear. A war grave that belongs to an identified nation has legal protections. A war grave that belongs to nobody is, in the most uncomfortable sense, available to whoever is willing to reach for it. And there are parties, some of them private, some of them governmental, who understand exactly what that means. Consider the broader strategic context of what this discovery represents. We are living in a period of renewed great power competition in the very waters where this submarine rests. The North Sea is not a quiet backwater. It is a strategically vital body of water bordered by the United Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, with critical undersea infrastructure, pipelines, communications cables, energy interconnectors, threading across its floor. It has become, in the last 2 years, a zone of heightened military alertness following documented incidents of sabotage against undersea infrastructure in the region, including the still incompletely explained damage to Baltic Sea cables in late 2024. The presence of an unidentified historical submarine in this environment is not simply a matter of academic historical curiosity. It is, in the assessment of people who think about these things for a living, a potential intelligence and security consideration. Because if there is one unclaimed, unaccounted for submarine sitting on that seafloor, the question that follows inevitably and uncomfortably is, how many others are there? The North Sea survey that found this vessel has documented more than 450 wrecks in the area being searched. 12 of those have been submarines. This particular find is the one that cannot be assigned to any known inventory. But the survey is ongoing. The The seabed is vast. The instruments are getting better every year, and the gap between what the historical record claims and what the physical evidence is revealing shows no sign of closing. The Soviet L-19, the last submarine sunk during World War II, went down in the La Pérouse Strait in August 1945 during a reconnaissance mission against Japanese forces. As recently as June 2024, a Russian expedition backed by the Russian Geographical Society and the Pacific Fleet's Hydrographic Service was still searching for it, using advanced sonar equipment across 3 designated search areas, having still not located it after nearly 80 years. A submarine lost in the final days of the last World War, from a military superpower with extensive records of its own losses, has not been found to this day. The ocean, it turns out, is more than capable of keeping secrets that governments assumed were settled. This is not chaos. This is the accumulated weight of a century of assumptions being quietly dismantled by technology that didn't exist when those assumptions were made. The archivists of the post-war world did their best with what they had. What they had was incomplete. What the sonar now shows is the difference between those two things, rendered in cold steel on a dark seafloor. There are people who study this professionally, maritime archaeologists, naval historians, intelligence analysts with specialties in historical exploitation, who will tell you, carefully and quietly, that the story of World War II's undersea war is not finished being written, that the accounting, for all its apparent completeness, has gaps that can only be measured when you compare what the documents say against what actually exists. That comparison has now begun in earnest, driven by the economics of commercial seabed surveys and the capabilities of modern sonar technology. And what it is finding is not what the historical consensus promised it would find. The submarine on the floor of the North Sea has been there for 80 years. It has made no demands. It has asked no questions. It has simply waited in the cold and the dark for instruments precise enough to see it, and a world curious enough to ask what it is. Now, both of those things exist, and what happens next, who investigates, who claims authority, who gets access to whatever is inside that sealed hull, will be determined not by the past, but by the present, by the interests and the calculations of nations that are very much still operational, still keeping their own secrets, still watching. The question is not simply whose submarine this was. The question is what it was doing. The question is who knew it was there and said nothing. The question is what 80 years of silence in every relevant naval archive actually means. And perhaps most importantly, the question is what else is down there in waters we thought we had mapped, in history we thought we had closed, waiting for the sonar ping that changes everything we thought we knew. Because if one submarine can sit unclaimed in one of the world's most studied stretches of ocean for 8 decades, hidden not in a deep trench at the edge of the world, but in relatively shallow water in the middle of a heavily trafficked sea, if that is possible, then what else has been sitting there, silent and sealed in plain sight of everyone who wasn't looking in quite the right direction? That question does not have an answer yet. But it will. Because the surveys are continuing, the technology is advancing, and the seafloor is running out of places to hide.